So the talk I'm going to give this morning, some of you might have attended the 2022 Archaeology Day event, and I did deliver something similar about the monitoring scheme relating to scheduled monuments. But despite that, we've been running it now since 2020, so another 2 years has gone. So it's just good to give you an update and also just reflect on what we've been able to do as a result of that data. So I always like to start my presentations working for the National Park just to give a bit of background around national parks generally. So Pembrokeshire Coast, it's one of 15 in the UK and 3 in Wales. Although it'll probably be an interesting point that you might or might not be aware that there's consultations happening across the UK, so across Wales, England and Scotland to create additional national parks. So our family might actually get much bigger in the next few years. In terms of our national park, it's one of the older ones. So it was designated in 1952. And it's the only park, and hopefully you can just see the image here. Just get my pointer. So you can hopefully just see the outline of the national park here. It's the only national park in the UK that has the coastline as a major component, but it does have other environments, upland, woodland, and of course estuaries, so the Cleddau area. In terms of its purpose, so the National Park has 2 statutory purposes. So one is to conserve and enhance the special qualities of the National Park area, and that includes archaeology, which sits under the cultural heritage, but also it's about creating opportunities for people to learn and enjoy these special qualities. So thinking more specifically about archaeology and our role in relation to that, what you're seeing here, so on the left of the screen is a map of the National Park area on an OS map. And you'll probably see there's lots of dots on the map. They represent all of the records we hold for the historic environment in the National Park area. So there's thousands of them, and that will include things like archaeological sites, finds, features. Sometimes that's documentary evidence, and it's also a record that's continuously growing with planning and other research that happens. So hopefully some of the talks today in the National Park area, they will add to that record. And in terms of the type, so we're talking about sites that go back to the old Stone Age or the Upper Paleolithic, all the way up to recent times. We've got a real extreme in chronology. So things like World War II and Cold War sites as well. Similarly, what we've got on the right of the screen is basically a filtered down version which shows you the scheduled monuments for the National Park. I always struggle to find a colour that really highlights the features, but hopefully you can just about make out these dots. The dots, they're different sizes representing the area, the size of the area that's been designated. So what is a scheduled monument? Well, a scheduled monument is a site that's been designated of national importance, so it's got a bit more protection in terms of restrictions of what you can and can't do. And it's managed by the Historic Environment Agency for Wales, so that would be Cadw. And for the National Park area, they're scattered across the landscape, and there's about 287, or I always like to say there's about 286 point something, because one is slightly not quite in completely. So hopefully these two demonstrate that, you know, we have a responsibility as a national park, as part of our purpose, to try and look after the archaeological heritage in the national park. However, there are limitations to what we can do in terms of staff. So I work for the park as an archaeologist, but there isn't any other archaeologists, and also our budgets are restricted as well. So there are some limits on what we're going to be able to do, given the amount of features you have, especially if you think about the broader historic environment record for the area. The other thing probably to highlight is, like most national parks in the UK, we don't own a lot of the land. So obviously a lot of the work we try to do in relation to scheduled monuments, we have to work with others to be able to carry out that work. So with those factors in mind, I'm thinking about, we'd like to develop this quite system to, you know, improve archaeology in the park. We decided to focus on the scheduled monuments, and to slim it down a bit further, because even 287 is a lot for us to help look after. We decided to focus on the publicly accessible sites. So that's almost half of all monuments in the National Park. Although I must add that since the scheme has been running, we have added some for the military rangers. So we've got our ranger visiting those sites, and we've also got some landowners who are quite supportive for us to actually do the same for their monuments to help look after them. So I know some of you will have heard this, as I mentioned at the start, but in 2020, we wanted to develop this monitoring scheme, and this was going to be run whereby volunteers would visit those sites, and they would then report back on any issues they identified. To make it as accessible to the widest possible audience, or those who'd like to do it, we try to keep that task simple. So it's just a case of going out. Essentially, anyone who likes to go out in the outdoors could visit the sites, and then we'll just highlight issues they're finding in that area that's been protected. So hopefully a nice, straightforward. And that was via an online form, which we're still using today, and that can accept photos and a bit of description around, what they've identified. Even if they've identified actually the monument is doing fine as it currently stands. So the purpose of the scheme is really to help us to identify issues on those on the sites being monitored, and then as a result, we can then hopefully carry out work at those monuments, or we can pass that information on to others who can do so. So it's, in a way, it's helping us target our limited resources. If you think about what I mentioned before in terms of the limitations we have to try and help look after the historic environment. It's probably worth highlighting that it's not always possible for us to deal with some of the issues that have been identified, and that can be due to logistics, for example, site being too remote, and there's no way for us to get there to carry out the work, practicalities, or it could be the type of issues. So things like coastal erosion, that process is, we can't stop it, it's just a natural process. But we can hopefully do other things to try and mitigate. So I think the aim of the scheme is really to lead to monuments that are better protected and enhanced, both for the current and future generations. Well, that's what we hope anyway. And we also think it's a great way for the volunteers involved to engage with archaeology in the park. So in summer 2020, we put out the call for volunteers to attend the 2 virtual sessions. So the first one was really just an introduction. So it was really about archaeology and about archaeology in the park. And then those that were interested then went forward for the second session. And this is where we really carried out the induction and training, how you would carry out the monitoring, how to visit. So we did all that. And then of that, so those who then decided they wanted to proceed, we then allocated sites. And we tried to allocate based on where people live as much as possible to keep it local. And that is across the national park area. And some of the volunteers were actually very, very experienced. They'd done lots of volunteering with other organisations, so they were very happy to just go ahead and just start doing that monitoring. And then obviously I would give feedback as things came in. Others who had never done anything relating to archaeology before, they felt it'd be beneficial for us to do one-to-one training, and that's what we did. Of course, 2020, very distinct year because of COVID. We had to obviously do things with those restrictions in mind as well. So the visits were all done in the autumn and winter of 2020 by the volunteers, and then I then reviewed them. Took me quite some time with all the other duties, and then I was going to provide recommendations on future visits and possibly, in an ideal world, what we could do in relation to this particular site. Really, really positive, and I think shows the success of the scheme. Since 2020, we've had almost 700 visits to those sites. So that's really, really positive. And almost an equal amount have been assessed. But now we're kind of getting to that point where we know where the issues are. They might be revisiting and then just highlighting that that issue hasn't changed. And probably the most positive thing, I think, is that many of the original volunteers, which I know some are here today, are still visiting the same sites 4 years later. So that's really positive. And we've also had some new volunteers join us as well. So hopefully what you can see here is just a flow chart, and this to us is it's kind of a simpler way of us understanding that process of how the scheme in an ideal world for us would work to help us improve their condition. So the first stage will be the staff or volunteers. So I mentioned that our range on the military ranger, she's now monitoring. So it's either volunteer staff, they will visit the site. Then the second phase is they'll submit that info via online form. That information will then be assessed by myself and also my colleague Rhiannon, who supports me with this. If any action is required, we'll think of what action plan could be put together. And then we'll either carry out that work. Obviously, if we need consent, we'll ask for that. Or we'll pass on those suggestions to the landowner, for example, if we can't do it ourselves. And then if work is carried out, in theory, hopefully that will improve the condition, or at least that monument will become stable. If there's no issues, then obviously we just ask the volunteer to continue to monitor, and hopefully that means the monument's in a stable condition. And essentially, it's just repeat that process over time. So in terms of what have we found so far from this monitoring scheme, so hopefully you can see, so these are all the different types of identified issues which are affecting the monuments, and hopefully at the bottom you can see the total number of all those visited monuments that are affected by that particular issue. So hopefully it gives you an idea of what the main areas we're having issues in the national park in terms of the monuments being monitored. So actually almost 90% of scheduled monuments that have been visited have some sort of issue, but some of those issues are minor, or they're things we can't really do much about. So it's worth bearing that in mind. And hopefully you can see the biggest issue we have is vegetation encroachment. So that's things like bracken, gorse. We also have some invasive species at some sites, which I'll show you afterwards. So Himalayan balsam or Japanese knotweed, ivy affecting structures. So that's a really big area. And a lot of the work we've done as a result of this monitoring is on sites affected by scrub. The other area is heritage crime. So really positive that the monitoring is picking up these issues, because prior to this, we had a little bit of information, but now we've got a much clearer idea, and I'll come on to some examples and what we've done in relation to those particular issues. You'll see that there's also erosion on there, and that includes things like vehicle erosion, footpath erosion, stock erosion. So lots of these things, a lot of them are localized, and in a lot of cases, you monitor them and see if actually they're quite stable. You know, you might have lots of people visiting a site at one time of the year, but another time is getting that time to recover. But you'll also notice that I've also kept coastal erosion separate, and that's because this is a significant issue for us as a national park, and it's particularly an issue for lots of the monuments. So hopefully you can see that the percentage of coastal erosion is almost the same as erosion for all other types of erosion. So just thinking about things like coastal erosion, there's not much we can do to stop this process. So the best thing we can do is monitor and also do other things. And I'll come on to some examples of what we've done in relation to those sites. It's probably interesting that vegetation encroachment and coastal erosion are particular high issues for monuments, because they're more likely to get worse with climate change. So as the weather patterns change, it'll become more difficult for us to manage the scrub because of changes. Birds will nest at different times and other wildlife will adapt. And also just the weather itself, so it might become more difficult. So maybe more of the sites will get affected by this. And the same with climate change. As the weather becomes more extreme, we will end up potentially with more issues in relation to coastal erosion. We're probably going to lose more heritage as a result. And on that doom and gloom note, I'm going to show you some examples of what we've done as a result of our monitoring. So the first example, this is from a recent edition. So this is on Castle Martin Range. And I visited the site with the area ranger back in February 2024. This one is Bullabia Hill Camp. And hopefully you can sort of make out the features. We've got some ramparts and we've got the central bit of the site as well. But hopefully what you can see is it's the extent of scrub at this site. So as a result of that monitoring, we've highlighted this to the Ministry of Defence, and we're hoping that they've got a conservation arm. We're hoping that actually some scrub clearance will be carried out. But of course, we need to also think about the long term, so things like grazing regimes and stuff to help with that. But it just highlights that the monitoring has identified this, and we're looking at ways to address that issue. Some other examples, and unfortunately, this is going to be quite scrub heavy. The examples I've got. So what you've got on the left of the screen, you're probably thinking, oh, that just looks like a big bush of scrub there, but actually what's behind that is a rampart. So what you've got is gorse, I think you've got some blackthorn, you've got some ivy, you've got all sorts of vegetation growing on the feature. So that is Fish Pond Camp near Stackpole. We have actually put a work programme in place. We've also got consent to do some of the work, and that is a National Trust site, so we're working in partnership with them, and hopefully we can carry out some of the scrub clearance work there. So it's on our schedule to do, but that was highlighted as a result of the monitoring. And then if we look at the top right, hopefully for those of you who maybe haven't seen Japanese knotweed before, once you've seen it and you know what it looks like, you then spot it everywhere. I know there's some in Haverfordwest, by the college, by the roundabout. If you're going on the bypass, if you look to your left, there is a dense patch of it there. But yeah, once you've seen it, you see it everywhere. So this was actually growing on a medieval leat in St. David's at an area called Merivale. It also had Himalayan balsam. So since that's been identified, there's also a lot of scrub and woodland issues there. We have actually started carrying out work to treat the invasive species there, and also we're trying to clear the scrub. There's also issues there with water causing damage to that monument. If you remember last year, we had lots of rain into this year. That's causing lots of erosion issues there as well. So there's quite a few issues happening there, but we are trying to find ways to address those issues. And then the bottom one on the right is Caerbury Mill. And this is just showing an example. Again, we've got this scrub that's been identified on this former structure. We haven't done anything yet with this site, but the plan is that we will carry out some work there in the future. The next one is Millhaven Rath. This is not far from St. Bride's, so it's in the west of the National Park. The aerial view was actually taken by myself using a drone, and this is just after we've done some scrub clearance of the ramparts. So the ramparts are these bits here. So we've done lots of clearance of that in 2023. I'll show you what that looked like. So hopefully this top image is showing you one of the ramparts and how dense it is in scrub. And then hopefully below you can see the results after myself and a group of volunteers and contractors helped clear the monument. Of course, now the task is to try and continue to do that, to keep that site looking in an improved condition. In addition, if I just go back to the other slide, so the majority of this area is covered in bracken. So what we're doing, we started it this year. We did it a bit late, actually, but we're planning to go back and we're going to be doing more bracken bashing, and that will be a combination of using strimmers, but also using hand tools. So we do that with volunteers, and also you can see there's a suspicious character there, trying to tackle lots and lots of bracken. The next one that we've been working on, oh, what's happened here? There we are. This is another drone shot that I took, and this was just before we carried out work. So this is Point's Castle Mound. It's a medieval motte from Brawdy area, and hopefully what you can see is it's covered in trees and it's covered in dense scrub as well. And what this shot was taken in 2023, prior to us carrying out work with the National Trust. And hopefully you can just see the dramatic difference. They're not quite the same images. It's very difficult to actually get this image because that scrub's just making it difficult. This image was taken just after we started monitoring. So this is from 2021 when the volunteer visited, and this is actually from this year. So this is how it's looking. It's starting to regenerate, so it's looking in a much more improved condition. And that was done with the National Park Authority in partnership with the National Trust. So we're really grateful for their help with that one. Moving on to another area of the national park, so Manabia. You will have seen this, I think, when I did the talk in 2022, but I just wanted to highlight that work at this site is still ongoing and there's issues we're still trying to tackle there. Hopefully what you can see in that first image on the left is you hardly can see the site. So for people who are visiting, there's a path running right by. They're probably passing and not realising. Also, there was a panel on site which was on a weird angle, so it wasn't really enhancing the monument or providing useful information in the location it was in. So we decided in 2022 to carry out some initial scrub clearance, and this is sort of the result of that. We also replaced the panel as well at that site. Really sad, this one, because there was a project there a few years before. It had been pointed in lime, and then there was no plan for what to do long term. So hopefully what we're doing is trying to look after that site over a longer term period. The other thing we've done this year, so you can probably see there's some vegetation issues on the top of the structure. We're actually working with a contractor to try and tackle the ivy that's growing on that monument, so spraying it. Ivy is a very difficult a plant to actually treat because it's got that waxy outer surface. So you almost need to break that down first before you actually are able to actually tackle the ivy. A very recent addition. So this is one that's on private land. So this is Newport Castle. And what we've got here is hopefully what you can see. We were made aware of this last year. There's a really diseased, very large beech tree next to, you can see it probably better in these ones, the South Tower, the outer bit of the South Tower. We were concerned that this would come down. So last year we started the process of getting scheduled monument consent. Obviously we had to wait until bird nesting season was out of the way. We missed the autumn winter window last year. So the plan was to do it in this window this year. While we were waiting, and we also needed tree preservation order exemption because it's within a conservation area, the tree actually did come down. So what you're seeing in the middle is the result of a significant part of the tree coming down. Just by chance, probably about that much, it just missed the South Tower. So considering how important this monument is, we potentially would have lost that. But fortunately, just by chance, it didn't happen. And then what we did, we realised actually what remained of the tree was still an issue. So we decided to get that work done ASAP. So we got it felled. And what you're seeing here is what we call a habitat stump. There were some potential bats. So in terms of the work, when it was felled, they were carefully dropped to the ground using ropes, so no ground disturbance was caused. Obviously, potentially, when this happened, we couldn't mitigate against that, but we did do mitigation when we finally got around to this job. And we hope that this will help with things like nature recovery, creates a little bit of a habitat for wildlife. And then finally, the last sort of conservation example I've got relating to sort of scrub. This site was on our radar already, but it was really useful that we were that we had a group of people monitoring this site. So this is the remains of the Square Tower at Nevern Castle. The site was excavated by Chris Capel, who has talked at Archaeology Day in the past from Durham University, and it was excavated between 2008 and 2018. At the time, some conservation was done on the circular tower and also part of the square tower, the bit you can't see in this image, by Cadwraeth, an arm of Cadw. However, because excavation was still ongoing, it wasn't possible to finish that work at the same time. So we knew we needed to get this done, but it was really useful just to have that, seeing how things were progressing as the monitoring had started. What you can see here on the left of the screen is all the vegetation that's growing on the monument. It's really difficult to see in this image, but there's also the structure is very unstable. So parts of the face, or the original face, had collapsed or was at a very precarious angle. We also had the core was exposed. So this site was really, really vulnerable. So for the past few years, working with CADU and the Nevern Community Council, and also Dr. Chris Capel as the specialist on this site, we put a work programme together. We obtained consent to rebuild the face, and we did that using the same approach, so clay mortar. Obviously, the technology has slightly changed since the medieval period, but we used clay mortar, which is not many people are able to do, and we used slate, and we rebuilt the face, and then we soft capped in turf. And hopefully you agree that the result is really positive. The other positive thing is that the contractor who worked on this, they were given a bit of training from Cadwraeth. They have done some work, but not on this scale. So hopefully that's also upskilled them. So we talk sometimes about shortages in the heritage sector, particularly the built environment. And hopefully by creating these opportunities, we're hopefully bringing new contractors in who can help look after the historic environment, which is really important. And then I mentioned before, in some cases, there'll be sites where we've identified a potential issue or there's issues that we can't do much about. So the image on the left of the screen is the standing stones at Tafarn y Bwlch on the Preseli. You can see they're at a very precarious angle. So what we decided to do, we didn't really want to do any intervention at this stage, but what we want to do is monitor if that angle is getting worse. So what we've done, we took this drone survey, I think earlier this year. We've just created this 3D model. You can see our 3D models on Sketchfab. And essentially that is just to monitor to see if that's going to get worse. So we'll go back and redo a drone survey. And there's a few other standing stones which have the same issue. And we will just keep monitoring them to see, is it something that's, we're going to have to address at some point in the future. And then the images on the right of the screen, top and bottom, these are sites which are right next to the coastline. And the idea here is, as I mentioned, we're not going to be able to do much about that process of coastal erosion, and probably going to get worse because of climate change. But what we can do is we can carry out drone surveys. This is a first attempt at doing this. We're probably going to have to go back because the lighting wasn't brilliant when we did it. But essentially, we were trying to preserve by record, essentially, in this case. You can do things like excavations, and I know there's some grand projects where people move monuments, but obviously that brings up other questions around whether you do that or whether they should be left where they were originally. But just some examples there. So we are using drones to help us. We're also using drones. So if I go back to the Nevern Castle, these images were taken using the drone, and we've also created a model of that. So we can actually see what that looked like before we did the work and after, and we can continue to go back. So we're also using drones where we're actually carrying out that conservation work. And then sort of I highlighted that heritage crime is an issue for a lot of the monuments that are being monitored. So what I wanted to highlight here is just some of those key types of issues that have been appearing. But before I do, I just want to highlight the National Park coordinates the Heritage Watch scheme for Dyfed Powys. There is a stand here today, so if you want a leaflet, you're welcome to take one with you. But since we've been collecting this monitoring data, I'd say that the scheme has been really positive in supporting this scheme. It's led to an increase in reporting and also police awareness of the issue. They sometimes do more patrols because they're more aware of these issues. We can target patrols, so we know certain issues, like some of the examples I'm going to show, happen at certain times of the year. We're having those discussions at our quarterly meetings with CADU, the police and others. So we're talking about what do we do about these issues, so a bit of brainstorming. And also we're carrying out repair work where we can in relation to those affected sites. As a result of the work around Heritage Watch and the monitoring, we've also raised the awareness around heritage crime. So it's been covered by both national, regional, and also local broadcasters. And also it's been in news outlets. So that's really good. And it's just raised the public awareness of this issue. So we now get actual reports from members of the public, hopefully as a result of the scheme. So just some examples. I'll leave you to interpret what these mean. But so a very typical one we get is graffiti. And this one is from the Tenby Town walls. It was identified in 2020 by our volunteer. And as a result of that, Pembrokeshire County Council were made aware as they manage these, the walls, and they were able to carry out the clearance. So hopefully you can see the difference here, which that's really positive. So this has been identified at a number of sites across the national park area. And, similar to what's happened in Tenby, we'll try and carry out the same action to remove it where we can. Unfortunately, sometimes that's not possible due to the way they've carried out that graffiti. So another typical issue we have, and hopefully this image is showing that, is fire. So we have issue with people having fire within scheduled monuments, whether that's ignorance or just don't care, who knows. But what we found is, so these are some examples. So on the left, you've got the remains of a campfire, which was on Carnalu, which is a really remote part of the Preseli Hills, and that was identified in 2024. The top right is Chechatribedd burial chamber, and this person was kind enough to put this on social media. So it helped the police track them down quite easily in this case, and we're able to speak to them about how appropriate this was, or inappropriate, I should say. And then last but not least, another very appropriate one here. Our ranger for St. Govan's Chapel found this inside the chapel, which was also great. So in terms of this sort of activity, what we do try and do is we try to remove the material from there to try and discourage others. Obviously, with the image at the top there, what the police said is for them to take that post down, because the concern for us is lots of people see this and think, oh, that's a lovely idea, and then they'll do the same. So we try to mitigate that as well, so people don't get the same ideas. Again, this has been identified across lots of areas in the park, and it tends to happen in the busier periods, so in the summer months when we have more tourists visiting. Not that I'm saying it's tourists related, but it tends to happen at that time of the year. And then finally, another example typically we found through the monitoring is disturbance. So this example here is of Canbrew round cairn, a Bronze Age cairn on the top of above Newport on Canlingy Common. It's been reconsolidated twice. The sad thing about Bronze Age cairns and people's lack of awareness is as they keep disturbing them, we'll go back, we'll reshape them to try and make them look less disturbed. But every time we do, it's changing it further and further. But we know from satellite imagery for this particular example that it has changed a lot in the last 20 years. So we're never going to be able to get it back to how it would have looked in the past. But what we can do is try to make it look less disturbed. And hopefully, a bit like the fire, we'll get less disturbance from this. And just to my CADU colleagues who are in the audience, a report is on its way for this one. But we've literally just done this one. But we did have consent. And just on that point, this one was really good because we managed to do this with a group of police cadets aged 13 to 14. They really enjoyed it. They were from the south of the county. I'm not sure some of them had ever been to the Preseli, so it was a great opportunity to get them out. We're hoping to do more work with them, and they came out with the PCSOs who were trying to manage them as well. But they did a great job, so fantastic that they came out and were engaging. And it's a group that we struggled to get interested in heritage. So hopefully some of them will have become interested as a result of this opportunity. So in terms of support for our volunteers, so the volunteers can contact me, and then if they have any queries, and I will respond to that. We have held catch-up events in the past. Unfortunately, we've not been able to do that this year due to other commitments, but we held one in 2022 and 2023. I'm hoping, for those of you who monitor or sitting in the audience, I'm hoping to set one up for next year. This one is from 2022, and I know some of you who are in this image are here today. This is from Castell Henllys. We do a bit of a presentation about where we're up to, but we also try to provide a bit of a fun opportunity. So here they were learning the traditional way to start a fire. Obviously, we don't want them then to go off and use this on some of those sites which are affected. That clearly was not the intention of this. And then, and other things that we try to do is we try to keep them updated on developments in relation to sites. And we also cover things like expenses, like mileage and any other costs as well. So in summary about the monitoring, I think the monitoring has contributed to the management of archaeological sites in the national park. It's also been beneficial, I think, for the well-being, the health and well-being of our volunteers. They're able to connect with others and stay active and get outdoors in the national park, which is one of the key things we like to get people doing. It's also hopefully creating a sense of place and also a connection with the past. It's also created wider opportunities and activities. So, carrying out some of that conservation work, some of them are involved, and also other volunteers who aren't involved in monitoring get the opportunity as well. And also, I think it's a more efficient use of limited resources. And as time's going on now, we're really starting to work out where to focus our time. And I think for me, because of the limitations, I'd rather do a good job on one site rather than do a really crap job on loads of sites. So that's kind of my philosophy, really. Let's focus on the sites where we can do a good job rather than just trying to do lots of things and not do it very well. Important considerations, I would say, with a scheme like this is, access to support and expertise is key. If you haven't got that, then it's going to be really difficult. People just won't know what they're doing, or they won't be able to get their questions answered. The purpose of collecting the data. So for us, hopefully those case studies show that we are doing something with that data, not just collecting it for the sake of collecting. Data management. So how do you manage all that data that's coming in? Costs, so things like supporting volunteer expenses and other things, and staff time. Investment time. So at the beginning, there's a lot of time is required, but that pays off. As you get into the scheme, it becomes much easier and less time consuming. Managing volunteer expectations and needs is really crucial. I'm sure at times I've failed because I've been busy with other things, but hopefully most of the time I'm able to manage that. And then finally, probably very important, is sustainability. So there's no point running a scheme like this if you're not going to be able to run it past a few years. And unfortunately, we do see that with some projects where they come to an end and there's no long-term plan, which is a real shame. And then just before I finish, I just wanted to highlight, and this is my own thought on reflection on what do we do in the park, and hopefully this sort of highlights all those other areas. So I think the monitoring fits within a lot of these areas, but hopefully highlights, going back to points around limitations on what we can do, hopefully highlights what what else we are doing, and hopefully that just shows that what we've achieved with this monitoring scheme is really, really positive. But we won't be able to do it without the volunteers and also without support of other colleagues, both internally and externally. So finally, I'd just like to say thanks, and I know some of them are here. Thanks to the volunteers for collecting the data and spending that time doing that for us, because I definitely wouldn't have been able to visit 700 sites in the last 4 years, even if I was doing it full time, all the time. And I also just want to say thanks to the staff in the park for supporting me. And that includes people who are managing the volunteers and also people like Rhiannon in my team as well. So, so that's thank you from me, and thank you very much for listening to this talk.